Hello, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to American Lit Session 21 out of 31 sessions. For more information about this American Lit class, you can visit Thelma's Library, thelmaslibrary.com. Materials there would include the 430-page syllabus. It's a large PDF you can download and look at online or print it double-sided and then 3-hole punch it and put it in a 3-ring binder. That's what I suggest. Every week we read from our syllabus pages. Session 1 has all the materials that you need to begin class and a video that explains what all of the different paper is for. This is perfect for running a homeschool class. I am a Christian, and so this material is very Christian. For example, right now, session 21, we are in the middle of Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're just getting ready to finish that book up. If you don't know about Uncle Tom's Cabin, or you think it's a bad book or something like that, you need to watch this session. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the Uncle Toms in history who have been so careless of their own safety and care that they would do anything and endure anything to witness to others. May we be like Christ, like Uncle Tom. I pray that you would bless anyone taking this class and all of us as we read through Uncle Tom's Cabin, whether for the first time or the second or the 10th, that we could become more like him and selfless and giving and care more about others than ourselves. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. All right, moving ahead. You have a volunteer from last week, someone who volunteered to read a selection from the Valley of Vision. Let's go ahead and pause the video for that. Okay, we're back. Schedule review session 21. We're continuing in Uncle Tom's Cabin. In fact, we're finishing Uncle Tom's Cabin this week. We're reading chapters 37 to 45, and our quiz will be over last week's reading, Uncle Tom's Cabin, chapters 26 to 38. In the PowerPoint today, we'll be talking about Darwin mercy killing in Uncle Tom's Cabin. We read about that last week, and we will be working through our structured notes, the ones that are listed as realism/naturalism and determinism. Of course, these are all forms of romanticism. Realism is just not as much fun as early romanticism. Next week, we'll be starting novels of our choice from this same era. And those early romantic novels are the good stuff, and you will be able to choose from one of those. We'll talk more about that next week. When we get a little further from that, we get into what we now call realism and what we now call naturalism and what we now call determinism. And from there, these are just different flavors of romanticism. Reading this week, you're finishing the book and you are continuing to work on your Uncle Tom's Cabin paper, which is due next week. Your writing assignment was back in session 17. You were able to do a character study, a theme study, or a plot study. If you've already done a character study and a theme analysis, choose plot study, and vice versa. If you've already written one type of paper, choose another type of paper. Grades 7 and 8, 175 words, that's just several paragraphs. And grades 9, 10 is 225 words. Grade 11 and 12, the third category, 250 words. And please give your paper a title. And you need quotes. It says 5, 4, 3. It should say 3, 4, 5. Grades 7 and 8, 3 quotes. Grades 9 and 10, 4 quotes. Grades 11 and 12, 5 quotes. And that is from our book. You can use other sources, but I would prefer it was from the book. I like to keep you attached to the book, talking to the author as much as possible. Okay, we're finishing up Uncle Tom's Cabin this week. You can go ahead and pause the video for your quiz. All right, that wasn't very hard. Let's move ahead, move on. If you want, you can open up, I think this is page 27, 101 Poems, page 27, and we're reading from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Amazing poetress. She was not a slave. She was the daughter of slaves who were freed. So she has a very important perspective to share with us. She lived free while her parents were slaves who were freed. And so she has a very important perspective. I look at her lifeline from 1825 to 1911. So 1825, early on in our country, that's 50 years from 1775. That's really amazing. In 1911, she lived to see the first cars on the road driving around. What an amazing life. She didn't quite live up to World War I, but what an amazing period of time to live in. And she writes in her poem, "Bury me in a free land. Make me a grave where'er you will, in a lowly plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but not in a land where men are slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. His shadow above my silent tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to the shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair rise like a curse on the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash drinking her blood at each fearful gash, and I saw her babes torn from her breast like trembling doves from their parent nest. I'd shudder and start if I heard the bay of bloodhounds seizing their human prey, and I heard the captive plead in vain as they bound afresh his galling chain. If I saw young girls from their mother's arms bartered and sold for their youthful charms, my eye would flash with a mournful flame, my death-paled cheek grow red with shame. I would sleep, dear friends, where bloated might can rob no man of his dearest right. My rest shall be calm in any grave where none can call his brother a slave. I ask no monument proud and high to arrest the gaze of the passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves." What a beautiful poem. Oh my goodness, I love this poem. And what a fresh insight. Frances Harper writing from a time, 1911. If you have great grandparents, they may have been alive at that time. My grandparents were born in 1904 and 1906. So they grew up as children, and this was already just stories of the Civil War. My grandpa was the youngest son in a family of a bunch of boys. And when my grandpa, he was 10 when World War I began, and his oldest brother fought in World War I. And I have letters from 1918 that he wrote back home to make sure his cows and his little bit of what he owned was taken care of. And my own grandmother, born in 1906, and that's only 25 or 30 years after the 40 years after the Civil War, my grandmother told me stories of her children going to school. That would mean my mom going to school, and there were other kids there with their last name, and they looked like them. And my grandmother, I remember, my grandmother told me the story. She said she told her kids, we're not going to have anything to do with them, because during the Civil War, that part of the family had chosen to fight for the South, and our part of the family had chosen to fight for the North. And so they never wanted to find out if they were related, and they knew they must be. But it is amazing how fresh that is in American history. You who were born in the 2000s, 10 if you're 13, 2008 if you're 15, really amazing. Those of you born now, you need to talk with your grandma, talk with your great grandparents. If they are alive, you need to talk with them and get some stories, because once they are gone, you will not have their stories unless they wrote books or kept journals and kept it all down. You need to talk to them now so that you can get all of their cool stories and get a feel of first person American history. That's what this poem is. It's a first person look. That's why we read literature. It's a first person look You can vicariously experience not what it was like to be a daughter of freed slaves, but to walk into her feelings during the time she wrote this poem. You can walk right into Frances Harper's feelings of what it was like to be the daughter of freed slaves and thinking about even where she would be buried. She just didn't want to be buried anywhere where there had been, where there were slaves. And of course, there were no more slaves after 1911. But she, how would you know if you were the daughter of freed slaves, whether that could come back, whether that could happen again? You would not know, would you? What are the consequences of man as an animal? What are the consequences if you are an animal? If you have descended from apes? What do things matter? And what does that mean if you have descended from an ape? What does that mean to you as a person? And what does that say about Darwin? Now, Darwin wasn't a real scientist. Most people are aware of that by now. In fact, a lot of scientists are trying to back away from Darwin, personally, of course, and say, well, it's just his ideas. It's not him as a person. It really doesn't matter, that he married his young cousin and things like that. That doesn't matter. What matters is that he had this idea, this evolutionary idea. But even the ancient Greeks had ideas like that, even ideas about rocks turning into people as you throw them over your left corner and your right shoulder and your left shoulder, things like that. But Darwin's influence on scientific thought was profound. We can't get around that. But his hypothesis, do you know what a hypothesis is? You have an idea of how the world came around, or any other idea, but for Darwin, it was how the world came to be. That's a hypothesis. And his was that mankind comes from apes. And that influenced thinking about everything, thinking about economics, how we spend our money. Think about it. If you are descended from an ape, then perhaps a highly intelligent ape, one that can build with blocks and understand a few signs and things like that, sign language signs, then perhaps that ape has more value than a debilitated person, human being. And that's the point that gets made by thinkers today, especially people like Peter Singer. He's easy to research. He's still alive. He is the chair of ethics at Princeton. We'll talk about him a little later today. But the idea that how should we even spend our money? If we are not in the image of God, if we are animals, then even how we spend our money should be different. And race, the idea that there's more than one race. And that is essential, especially when you go back in time to a time of American slavery. What we think about race. Is there really more than one human race? Is there a black race and a red race and a pink race? And I don't know what white is. We're not really whites. They're creamy race, and blacks aren't really black. Is there a chocolate race? Is there a caramel race? Is there a strawberry race? Or is there a race with really round eyes and a race that doesn't have round eyes? Is there a race with big noses and little noses? What about a race of people with red hair and fair skin? And so is there more than one human race? And if you believe the Bible and you believe creation, then the world is only about 6,000 years old, possibly up to 10, I think about 6,000 years old. But there's only one human race, and we're all descended from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And all of these variations of human beings are easily explained by inbreeding. After Shem, Ham, and Japheth, yes, there's a whole bunch of inbreeding, but our gene pool was so pure at that time that they did not see those anomalies by marrying your cousins, things like that. You didn't see all of the horrible things that happen. That's why it's illegal now to marry your first cousin, because the chances of having something abnormal happen just go way up. We saw that with British royalty. We saw that in Egypt, having a pharaoh marry his sister. We see all types of horrible abnormalities within royal families, and that's all from inbreeding. But inbreeding with a pure gene pool, if you go back to the time of Noah and then Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you don't have abnormalities. But if these people move apart from each other, you do explain how some people have really light skin and some people end up with dark skin, and some people have high brows, and some people have low brows, and some people have red hair, and some people never see red hair. Did I say that already? Some people have blue eyes, and some groups never see any blue eyes because they just got genetically pushed out. Nobody married, with blue eyes, and nobody had those to pass those on, or brown eyes or green eyes or anything like that. Colors of hair, just differences in us, and inbreeding explains all of that. So race and class. Race affects class. If you believe that there's more than one human race, that there are, for example, 20 different human races, then class comes into being, because obviously some of the races are going to be more advanced than others. They've all been off separate, growing by themselves and expanding their populations by themselves. And some of them have better genes than others. You're going to compare it, like Darwin does, with horse breeding or dog breeding, so that there are things you want to try to breed out of the races, breed out some diseases, or breed out the insane, or breed out the criminal. And it was believed in Darwin's time, people thought that that was inbred. They thought if your father was a criminal, you were more likely to be a criminal. And if your father or mother was insane, you were also likely to go insane. A lot of things have changed as science has shown things to be not true. And if you are like me, where you do have criminals in the background, my own father was a criminal. If you have criminals in your family, of course, you're embarrassed about it. But does that mean you're more likely to be a criminal? And that does not happen to be something that gets passed down. It's only passed down if your dad teaches you how to be a criminal, then you do it. My mom was really blessed that she was strong enough to escape from him, and we didn't even grow up with him. And so none of us, we decided not to be criminals. But that affects class too, because then you think some people are better than others. Some people are the ones who should be in charge. Even the British today have a class system, right? They have royalty. And forever, British princes and princesses have only married princes and princesses from around the world. It is only recently that with Prince William, that they married somebody because they loved them, not because they were royal, and they've kind of ran out of princesses. And you had William and Henry, and they both just married famous, wealthy people. And that was kind of like being royal. By today's standard, if you're famous or Hollywood, or your family sells party trinkets, that's what Catherine, William's wife, her family got wealthy selling party trinkets. And it turned out that being wealthy and wearing nice clothes and having a nice house, well, that's the next best thing to royalty, so you can marry them. Amazing. And of course, we don't do that much really here in America. Here in America, we don't have princes and princesses and kings and queens. We do have famous people. We have sports heroes, and we have a few really wealthy people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk that everyone knows their name. And if you met them, you might be a little bit in awe because they're so famous, but you wouldn't bow or anything like that. You'd reach out, shake their hand, and other areas of life. So the moral consequences are the dark side of this struggle for life. Social Darwinism, and this is mostly out of your glossary, suggests, and I know you've heard this before, I try and reword it every week, that in a society of competitors, are we competitors? Are you and I competitors? Do we compete against each other? Well, in small ways we do. The guys compete for the best girl, right? If you believe that. However, if you are a Christian, you're not competing for the best girl. You're competing for the girl that's best for you. You don't pick the cutest, prettiest, most popular girl. You pick the girl that you think God is calling you to pursue, and you pick her. And so that's not Darwinism. But in a society of competitors, those who prevailed did so through superior breeding. Those who failed, the poor, Asians, islanders, anybody who's not white like Darwin, African American, Irish, Chinese, etc., did so because of inferior breeding. Now, this is supposed to be insulting. I have relatives who are Asians, islanders, African American, Irish, Chinese. I have relatives from all of these people groups, from all these people groups, and it offends me. I hope it offends you. It is supposed to. What is an American after all? That's who we are. we're the poor Asians, Islanders, African American, Irish, Chinese. That's American. That's what we Americans are. Most of you probably can list at least 5 or 10 different people groups that are part of your family lineage. I hope so. Then you're really an American. Let's see, there we go. Just as the naturalist writers had done. Now we're getting into writing styles, and the naturalist writers, social Darwinists, tended to focus their arguments on the poor and disabled, right? Where the struggle of the species was most evident. Why would you focus your ideas in writing on the poor and disabled? Yes, you don't want them to have babies. You don't want them to have children. Now, not only did people think that the criminal mind could be inherited, they thought even being poor could be inherited, and that a disability could be inherited. Now, some disabilities can be inherited, but most cannot be. And poverty is certainly nothing that is inherited. Think of all the rags to riches stories that we have here in America, where anybody who works hard, and I'm going to add speaks perfect English and writes perfect English, that's why you must also speak perfect English, and you will speak perfect English if you learn to write perfect English, because you will know the way words are spelled so that you may pronounce them correctly and you can write well, and you will succeed no matter the color of your skin or whether you're Asian or African American or Irish or whatever, Chinese. But these writers focused on the poor. They focus on the disabled. And the idea is that these people are poor, it's not their fault, they're poor, and that is true in many cases. And they're disabled, it's not their fault, but we don't want them to marry and have babies, or we want to sterilize them. And there are all types of ugly histories of trying to sterilize, for example, prisoners in prison against their will, or offer them money, or tell them they're taking part in a survey and then sterilize them. There are ugly, ugly things, and they all stem from Darwin. They all stem from his idea. Was it really a struggle of the fittest species, or was it a struggle for survival? Were these poor people really, was it a struggle of the species, or were they just trying to survive, these people? And what about disabled people? Okay, I have an idea to throw out for you. I would love it if you would all either go get this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, or watch the 2-part series, National Geographic series. It is available. I don't know what streaming services offer it now. You'd have to look it up. National Geographic produced it. It's a 2-part series, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it is fantastic. It's evolutionist. It's really funny to hear this guy talk about life beginning in the Fertile Crescent. That would be Eden, talking about life beginning in the Fertile Crescent and talking about the spread of animals and domesticated animals specifically. And he is saying, why do some people still live in tents and spend all day looking for food and water? And why do have some societies, think of America or the British, why have some societies, they learned how to build buildings and they grow all their own food and they have leisure time and all this, are they really smarter? The group that live in fancy buildings and have indoor plumbing, is this whole group really smarter than the people who live in tents or sod houses and spend all day looking for food and water? How come those people have not figured out how to live the way, for example, I'm going to say we do, meaning you and me? Why? And he is going to present it because the evolutionist for 150 years has said they're not as smart, that it makes it easy into a class system or looking down on them from an evolutionary aspect, that their species of human has not developed as far as we have. They're not smart enough to do that. And so we reach out with helping hands and try to help them. And of course we should be helping them. But the idea that they're lesser evolved is ridiculous. And Gun, Germs, and Steel does a really good job. They narrow it down to the basic availability of food and water and what the climate is on different continents, basically. And that explains everything without descending into the depths of Darwinistic thought and just thinking that, well, the people groups who have indoor plumbing in the houses and all of that and electronics, who have factories and things like that, they're just smarter. They're further along in the evolutionary scale and they're smarter. No, we have really stupid heads and they've got stupid heads. People are people are people are people, if you believe in creation as it's put out in the Bible. And this guy, even though he's got an evolutionary standpoint, he does a great job of pointing out. He says, what do you really need to survive? You need food and water. And you kind of need a nice climate, doesn't hurt, to have enough sunshine, but not too much. And so people who had a moderate climate, people who have easy access to water, water's a huge, big thing. You've got to have it every day. People who have easy access to water and people who have food, especially domesticated animals. That would be cows and horses and sheep and goats and chickens and pigs. If you have those animals, they can easily be herded up. You keep them in a pen. They will all have babies. You've got milk, eggs, and meat right there. Cheese, butter, everything that you need. And then you can plant vegetables and fruits. But if you live on a continent or in a country where you don't have domesticated animals, where you have wild animals, you can't milk a zebra. You can't get a zebra to pull a plow. Think of the wild animals that will eat you. Horses, cows, pigs, chickens, they're not going to eat you. And, you don't have to go hunt them. So if you have to follow animals that migrate all over the place, cows and horses, horses, you could say, let's say cows, pigs, and chickens, they don't migrate. And so you have an easy food source. And if you go to the Middle East or parts of Africa, they don't have domesticated animals. And it's only been recently that some Christian groups have been, you've seen the Christian groups where you can go together and buy a pig for $200, and they will get a pig to a family. If that family has a pig, or two pigs, a boy pig and a girl pig, then they can have little piggies and then they can have bacon and they can sell it. Although if they're Jewish or Muslim, you don't want pigs, you want chickens or goats or something like that. And so domesticated animals are really where it's at. So this series, I've spent enough time talking about that, it's really cool because basically they make the biblical argument. He just doesn't know he's doing that. So I highly recommend that for you. Okay, I know this is way back in 1995, but the Stanford Humanists hosted a Darwin Day, and we still have Darwin Days. And when the 150th anniversary of the publication of the Descent of Man, those books, all from the 1850s, when those books were published, there was a 150-year anniversary later, and everybody was hailing Darwin and all that. And here at the Stanford Humanists, they were hailing Lucy, Darwin and Human Origins. And of course, the idea is that you can see the skull there, the primate, saying that Lucy walked upright. Now, there were just a few bones, I think in a tooth, I can't remember, with the Lucy. But basically, this is a hoax, and now we know that, but it's still taught. Lucy is still taught. But in the final estimation, our glossary says, social Darwinism, if you all are Darwinists, it affects how you think about everything. Social Darwinism, what you think in your mind about everything and everybody, appears to be a reaction to what was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of Darwinism, the rescinding of humanity's providential purpose. Humans no longer appear to exist for any particular reason. You are an accident. You're not made by God. You're an accident. The earth didn't need us, and it probably existed for a long time without us. And that's why you have people, humanists like Bill Gates today, who was recently divorced just a couple of years ago, got divorced from his wife, Melinda. She couldn't take the girlfriend thing any longer. Bill Gates had a previous girlfriend, and he had 1 or 2 weeks every year with this girlfriend. And that was part of his marriage to Melinda, was 1 or 2 weeks every year. He would still go have a fling with his old girlfriend. If you are not a Christian, nothing is beneath you. And the money breeds arrogance. And anyway, by now, most of you know that Bill Gates has the idea that now we need to get the human population down to 500 million. The earth had probably existed for a long time without us and probably doesn't need us or want us. Social Darwinism used this theological void I call it a theological void. It's the absence of God. People who think this way, God is not even in their worldview picture. And they challenge the notions of social charity, how we should spend money, but also to recast humanity's purpose as willful self-perfection, that your purpose here on earth is to make yourself happy and a better person, whatever makes you happy, not to go take care of other people. If you are a Christian, your purpose here is to imitate Christ, right? And that's right why we read books like Uncle Tom, because Uncle Tom imitated Christ. He's called a literary Christ type. And so Uncle Tom, you want to be like Uncle Tom, right? You want to act like Uncle Tom. No matter how bad your life gets, you want to be like Uncle Tom. You want to be like Jesus and imitate Christ, just like Uncle Tom did. No matter what it costs you, you want to do it. Even if you're going to get a whipping. If somebody else can't pick their basket of cotton, you're going to go help them pick it because you know you can take the whipping better than they can, right? That's the way it goes. Social Darwinism denies theology or religion as a motivating force in the world and instead perceives the universe as an accidentally created machine, just accidental. Okay, what about Lucy, since we brought her up? This photo is from Answers in Genesis, one of my favorite creation resources. You can just look them up online easily. That's the Kinham organization. This is from an article in 2012. I know it's 11 years ago, but Lucy was found in Ethiopia in 1974, so it is old information. We were told that she walked on two legs and therefore represents bipedality in one of our supposed ancestors, kind of like a missing link, because that's the whole big thing with evolution. No one's ever found a missing link. So this was a big deal that they were telling us Lucy walked. Well, according to a new study, Lucy was a tree climber. She's an ape, right? We have been told for decades that Lucy was some kind of ancestor. The more scientists learned about Lucy, the more apparent it became that she's just an ape. And there, with the Institute from Creation Research, the Answers in Genesis Association, they've created and showing you her arm bones that are obviously nothing like a human. If she was walking, she was a knuckle dragger, dragging her knuckles when she did walk upright, but she's not a missing link. The general theory of evolution, GTE, general theory of evolution, is the atheist creation story, right? They have to have some kind of story. They can't say, well, we can't go back that far, so we don't know how we came to be, but we're positive that it wasn't God. As with the Bible, that story begins with creation from nothing. And that's a little Latin word that I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try. I know most of you can say it. And in the atheist view, there really was nothing, and certainly no God to act as a first cause. First cause is what the ancient Greeks, if you ever take classical lit, there is some of classical lit, most of classical lit is up on YouTube, but it's from a classroom setting and I'm wearing a shield. It's from several years ago or a couple of years ago during the COVID crisis. I don't know if I'll get around to making classical lit, but you could look up classical lit and we talk about the first cause, the ancient Greeks, the philosophers, the people who thought of philosophy as a science called it a first cause because they didn't know what started the earth. So they simply called it the first cause. The Big Bang is what evolutionists call it. The Big Bang, they say, was the first cause that produced the universe all by itself. You had nothing and you had creation, all of life come from nothing. Somehow nothing exploded. There was nothing there, but the nothing exploded and then just happened to provide absolutely everything we needed for life and some simple form of life, some type of a amoeba or something. And from that, from Goo to You by Way of the Zoo, this is a book from the 70s by Harold Hill. This is a great book, by the way. Then billions of years later, we're told the first life formed spontaneously in some kind of chemical soup. And then without any help or maybe a lightning zap or something like that, evolved into all the plants and animals found on Earth today, including us. And of course, we've all seen so many movies with so much, what do they call that? When they play with the movie and make it look real, CGI, with all the CGI now, it's really easy to make people believe things like that because they've seen it in a movie with CGI. Contrary to the impressions given by the media, never before has there been so much evidence challenging the story of evolution. Such are the problems that secular cosmologists have in trying to make their Big Bang models work. They end up making desperate appeals to the most unscientific notions imaginable. And what have they finally concluded? Now that Darwin, we see that everything Darwin said, basically nothing is true except the whole theory. Well, they hold nothing Darwin said except to his theory that somehow we came from nothing. And that is so preposterous. And the idea of somehow we came from God is so unthinkable to a group of atheists that it is easier for them to believe in aliens. That rather than God and believe the creation story, that aliens planted us here and provided us with a planet that was perfect for our survival, distance from the sun and all of that, oxygen levels and gravity levels and all of that. It's easier for them to accept the idea of aliens. That's all in the last 10 or 15 years. Christians could see this coming, especially with all the CGI films. It makes it easier for the American mind to imagine that there are aliens. For example, in December 2014, top cosmologist Lee Smolin published a book suggesting that the only way to solve the Big Bang's many scientific problems was to argue that the laws of physics were different in the past. Okay, so we have the law of physics now. We know what gravity is. You drop an apple, it falls. We know what these things are. And so the only possible way to make evolution palatable is to say, well, even the laws of physics were different then. So when the facts don't fit their creation story, secular scientists have to turn to alternative scientific views, fictional scientific laws drawn from their imagination. Because it would be so horrific for them to open the Bible and read Genesis 1 and 2. Amazing, isn't it? Where we will go if we don't want to believe something. Similarly, the leading origin of life researchers like Paul Davies and Stuart Kaufman recently readily admit that no observed natural processes can produce a life from non-life. You can mix together all the chemicals that you want. But if nothing there is alive, you can't make life. Even if you zap it with electricity, you can't make it alive. Unperturbed, this reminds me of Journey to the Center of the Earth, the unperturbable Hans. Unperturbed, gotta love that word. However, they do the same as the secular cosmologists. They take a gigantic leap of blind faith. They're scientists, and they're taking this big leap of faith and believe that the required natural processes existed anyway. And for some reason, we just haven't discovered them yet. It is so repugnant to them, the idea of accepting that there is a God, that they will believe absolutely anything else. Amazing. Richard Dawkins, he's still alive. This is 2023 and he's still alive, is adamant that once first life formed, Darwin's theory can explain how this could have evolved into people. But why then are leading biologists like James Shapiro and Stuart Newman quietly looking for alternative theories? And this is a picture of Richard Dawkins, so you'll recognize him with a traveling bus. There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. Because Dawkins, very much like Friedrich Nietzsche says, I blame God for everything. I can't write the words big enough. I blame God for everything. That's why you feel guilty when you have intimate relations with someone outside of marriage. You feel guilty. Or if you have homosexual relations, you feel guilty. It's all because of the Christians, all because of them. That's the only reason you feel guilty, not because of some innate sense of right and wrong. It's all because of the Christians and that book, the Bible. And if we could just get rid of them and get rid of the Bible, you could just live your life how you want. Life is short and you could just enjoy it and quit worrying. And that is what the natural mind wants to hear, right? That's what the natural mind wants to hear. I always kind of presume that I have a mostly Christian audience or an audience who think they are Christians. Here's another bus. There's no Santa. There's no Santa. Your mom buys all the presents. The only thing cool about this picture is it's a double-decker bus in London, which is pretty cool, those double-decker buses. If you ride on top, you can kind of see more of the city. All of this points to a worldview, not a commitment to science, right? That's not a commitment to science. Scientific theories, if you, in real science, you present a theory You've got your peers review your theory. So you have, they all come to some symposium and you stand down there and show your PowerPoint or write on a whiteboard, you used to be, and you present your theory of whatever your theory is of, whether it's of evolution or creation or whatever. You present this theory, and then some of them try to prove it right and some of them try to prove it wrong. But they never just lock you out of the science hall and prevent you from publishing because they don't like your theory until recent years. And that's what they do now. They just don't let you publish. It's their way or the highway. All this makes our youngsters very vulnerable. Scientific explanations from the GTE can appear very convincing when only the evidence supporting this view is presented. If you go to school and the only thing you hear is evolution, you have no idea. You think creation must be such a fringe theory that it's not even worth talking about in school. And that's what's happening today. In Proverbs 18:17, we read, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him." And that would be correct scientific theory. You can write that in the margin of your Bible at Proverbs 18:17. Correct scientific theory. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. You present your case, you let your peers review you, and they try to prove you wrong or right. That's how real science used to work. How much more so when nobody with contrary evidence is allowed to speak? What happens if you shut out the dissenting voice? Evolutionary beliefs are maintained by censorship and with great effect. I like these two quotes. Sir Fred Hoyle, "We must now admit to ourselves that the probability of life arising by chance, by evolution, is the same probability of throwing 6 in dice 5 million consecutive times." And there are actually people who try to argue that that could happen under certain circumstances. And unless you have a loaded dice, that's not possible. That you throw a dice and you throw a 6 5 million consecutive times. Kind of helps make the point, doesn't it? And Joseph Fielding Smith, "If evolution is true, the church is false. If life began on the earth as advocated by Darwin, Huxley, Haeckel, and others of this school, whether by chance or by some designing hand, then the doctrines of the church are false. If there is no original sin, if there is no original human man, Adam, if Adam is just the super evolved man who finally is a human, then there certainly was sin and death before Adam, right? If there is any sin and death before Adam, then why did Jesus come?" Okay, we've been making comparisons. We decided we can see the theist examines evidence theologically. I'm going to presume you are a theistic thinker. Actually, most American kids are kind of theistic romantics, because they are following their hearts. All of our society simply leads you. Even when you graduate from high school, you're going to get a card from your aunt or your grandma that says, "Follow your heart, follow your dreams, and they will come true. If you try hard enough, you can do anything. You can be anything." And that's not really true. Yes, you should do what you do best, but what if what you want to do is not what you do best and you spend your whole life trying to get there? What if you want to be a sports superstar, but you know the odds are 10 million to 1, but you think if you try hard enough, you'll get there? What if you don't get there? How far do you go in life trying before you give up and do something else? That's the way it is. But we examine things theologically. The deist examines evidence scientifically, hopefully. The romantic examines evidence emotionally, according to their heart. How do they feel about this? And that's why we see divorce in such a horrible situation. And since the 60s, with the sexual revolution, with contraceptives available to everybody, so that you disconnect having babies with having intimacy with having babies. When you make that disconnect in the 1960s, it becomes a sexual free-for-all, because now you can live together without consequences of worrying that you're going to have kids. And it really removes that. And people thought that it was bringing in a freedom in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. But the truth is it was freedom just for men. It was freedom for men. Men could go around becoming intimate with whoever they wanted, just presuming that either they or the female would use some type of contraceptive, and you disattach it from marriage and family. And once you disattach it from marriage and family, You have accidental babies all over the place. And all of those accidental babies get aborted. A few of them get adopted, but most of them, there are many more babies aborted. There are a lot more people waiting to adopt than babies aborted. There are people left and right who would take those babies. People blame pro-life camps and say, oh, you just want to help the mother have the baby. You don't want to take care of the baby. That's not true. There are Christian organizations all over helping single women who are brave enough to have babies, whether they keep them or give them away. There are people who will give you clothes and diapers and moral support and tell you about the Bible and that God loves you anyway, and that mistake doesn't ruin your life, that baby can actually bless somebody else. You can start over. You can be born again, and that means born again. That means become brand new, right? Amazing. Whereas romantic, just evidence, the romantic examines everything just emotionally. Let's look at a few topics. Let's say human life. That's a hot topic, something to talk with your mom and dad and your pastor about. The theist says human life, we're created in the image of God, each person. And what if you're born disabled? Are you still created in God's image? Yes. What if all the able-bodied, perfect people had no sick people, no disabled people? What if there was no sickness and no disability on the planet? What would all of the, I don't even know what to call them, the people who aren't disabled, what would you do to make you a better person? Who would you help? Who would there be to help? If there weren't pregnant, unwed mothers and people who are sick and ill, if some of us did not bear burdens of disability, then there would be no one to help. And we know we know life here is short. It's a human testing ground. If you took Brit-Lit, or if you take Brit-Lit, and you'll be reading Paradise Lost and Pilgrim's Progress, you'll understand the whole idea is to help other people. This is like boot camp. Life here is like boot camp for the afterlife, which is forever. We know that we are created from the dust of the earth. We are mud, we're dirt, but we're not like the animals. We also have the capability, because we're in the image of God, we have the capability to create and to create art and to have other aspects of God inside us. And we have this desire to imitate Christ. And because one day we will be with him, and who knows what we'll get to do when we're with him. We're certainly not going to be sitting around on clouds playing harps. That's when the exciting life begins. But the boot camp, the training is all down here. It's all down here. We're created in the image of God. And if you're disabled, you're disabled. You're never disabled. Ask somebody like Joni, I think her last name is Erickson. I think she dove into a pool as a teenager and then was disabled from the neck down, paralyzed from the neck down. Plenty of people who live with the disabilities can tell you that disabled person blesses our family. That disabled person blesses me, blesses us. It makes you a better person because you're helping someone. I have a friend who babysits triplets every Friday for the last 2 years. She babysits triplets for an unwed mother who chose to keep her triplets. The Christians do all types of things. Does it make my friend a better person? You bet it makes her a better person. And she's very inspirational for the rest of us, for us to remember that we must help all of those who are disabled in one way or another also. So the theist believes human life, we're created in the image of God. Our body is a temple of God. We don't put drugs in it. We don't want to smoke. If you get saved and you're smoking, all of your friends, they're not going to come and judge you. They're going to come and try and help you to stop smoking or stop drugs or alcohol, whatever it is. We believe we're created for a purpose. Even if your mom tells you you're an accident, you're not. You were created for a purpose. You have a unique individual purpose. God has a plan for your life. Life is sacred. Life is sacred. It counts. Every day counts. God knows whether you have 15 years or 30 years or 80 years. He knows how long you're going to live. And that's how many years you get. And we do not get to know how many years that is. So every day is sacred. And we show compassion for the weak, the young, the disabled, the elderly. We're not looking to euthanize them. We are looking to help them along. the young people, the old people, the disabled, the weak. We're helping them. The deist looks at human life, and if you look at early deists, they're pretty much theists with a scientific bent. But a modern deist looks at a human being and says, well, you're a glob of cells, kind of like a machine. And they try to discover all the systems of your body, which is all good. And there are plenty of theists who are discovering all the systems of the body, all the systems of nature, for that fact, kind of dissecting everything like a machine to find out what we can do to make things better. But an atheist deist, of course, is looking at a human. You really are just a blob of cells. The romantic is all about self-expression, and they are illogical. I keep saying the cure for romanticism is logic. If you cannot explain how life began, and the Bible has an explanation, and you've worked for 6,000 years to try to explain how life began, maybe a logical explanation is to look at Genesis. Is it more logical to think of God or aliens? Excuse me. The romantic, it's all about semantics, which means word usage. It's all about, we'll call things, we're not going to say we're pro-abortion. So we're going to call ourselves choice. We're all about choice. Excuse me. It's all about choice. It's all about semantics, word usage. And the romantic believes there are no absolutes. Remember, the theist believes that there is a truth that is true for all people in all places at all times, every century, every decade. And the romantic, does the romantic believe in mercy killing? Okay, mercy killing. If you have your copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, open it up. Mine is the Norton Critical Edition. I like that. Only half the edition is the book. The other half is essays. Some of the essays are worthless, and some of them are absolutely profound. This is Uncle Tom's Cabin, chapter 34, about mercy killing. And I want to read to you a little bit. This is Cassie telling her life story to Tom, and they're in a shed. And Tom has been whipped, and she's trying to help Tom. And Cassie's saying how she met this guy, he wanted to marry her, but they never married. She lived with him for 7 years, and she thought that, and they were happy. They had 2 children. Let's see, they had 2 children, Henry and I think Elise was her name. I just wrote them down in my book. Tom has a Bible. Tom basically has lost everything in this world, right? He has no possessions. He doesn't even have his family at this point. He's very much like Joseph in Egypt down in the dungeon. You can make an analogy for that. In fact, that would be a good paper. You could compare Tom and Joseph in the Bible. Joseph, remember in Genesis, I think it was chapter 48, where Joseph told his brothers, he says, you meant it all for evil when you sold me into slavery. But he said, God knew it was going to be a good thing. And of course, Tom, this is going to be Tom's perspective, that he's there because God must have him there to tell somebody about Jesus. And that's how Tom ends up as a Christ type. In fact, I even refer to Tom's, his punishment, his severe punishment, as his passion. Tom, just like people talk about the passion of Christ, Jesus suffering for us. Well, Tom suffers for all of those other people. Tom even says, this is in chapter 34, he says, the Lord hasn't forgotten us. I'm certain of that. If we suffer for him, we shall also reign. Scripture says, but if we deny him, he will also deny us. Didn't they all suffer? The Lord and all his? It tells how they was stoned and sawn asunder. That's Hebrews chapter 11. And wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. That's John the Baptist. And was destitute, afflicted, tormented. Suffering ain't no reason to make us think the Lord's turned against us, but just the contrary. If we hold on to him and doesn't give up to sin. Poor grammar, of course, because it's Tom, he has no education. And so the idea is that Tom understands. He doesn't realize that he's actually a Joseph in Egypt type, a Christ type, or even a Job. who's lost everything, right? Lost everything, sick. Tom does not realize that, but he's listening to Cassie's story, and Cassie is saying, Legree has just brought a new girl in, poor Emmeline, and Cassie was Emmeline's age when she was bought by Legree, and he's just ruined her. She tells us she was bought for $2,000, and let's see, she lived with this guy for 7 years. They had two beautiful children, Henry and little Elise. This is very near the end of chapter 34. But then they were really, really happy for many years. And then some friend of his introduced him to another lady. And he, had an affair with this other lady, wanted her, and he sold Cassie and her kids, and her daughter was, now remember, these kids are free. They're free. They're living free kids. They think they're free. And Cassie is half Black, so she's fair skinned. And then her children are quarter Black, so they're very fair skinned. They could pass probably for white or to be Spanish or something like that easily. And they have a very excellent language skills and all of that. And then, but her little boy was bold and high spirited like his dad. He wasn't a slave, and he didn't know how to be timid. Elise was very timid, and the children were sold. And one day she's in the market. This is very late in chapter 34. And she sees her little boy, Henry, who breaks loose, screaming, "Mother, mother, mother." And they haul him off to go whip him for running away like that. And her heart is just torn from her. She's suffering, just thinking her child is going to be whipped for trying to come be with his mother. And Cassie, she says, something in my head snapped at that moment. I was dizzy and furious. And that's when she tried stabbing the guy. And then somebody else bought her and promised to do all he could to find and buy back my children. He went to the hotel where my Henry was, and they told him he had been sold to a planter up on Pearl River. That was the last I ever heard, which means if he sold upriver or downriver, there's no way to get back from that. Then they found where my daughter was. An old woman was keeping her. He offered an immense sum for her. This is the next man that loves her, but they would not sell her. Butler found out it was for me. He wanted her, and he sent me word I'd never have her. Captain Stewart was very kind to me, and he had a splendid plantation. And in the course of a year, I had a son born. So she's starting another life. And she's already suffering from the loss of her children. And she has this son born. Oh, that child, how I loved it. How just like my poor Henry the little thing looked. But I'd made up my mind. Yes, I had. Now remember, she's in a shed with Tom. Tom has been whipped horribly. And Cassie's gone in there to offer him some words of comfort. And Tom's, witnessing to her, and she's pouring out she's spilling her guts to him. But I'd made up my mind. Yes, I had. I would never again let a child live to grow up. I took the little fellow in my arms when he was 2 weeks old and kissed him and cried over him. And then I gave him laudanum. That'd be like an overdose of sleeping pills. And held him close to my bosom while he slept to death. How I mourned and cried over it. And whoever dreamed that it was anything but a mistake that had made me give it the laudanum. But it's one of the few things I'm glad of now. I'm not sorry. To this day, he, at least, is out of pain. What better than death could I give him, poor child? And then the cholera comes, and then Captain Stewart dies, and she gets it, and she wants to die, but she doesn't die, and she thinks that's kind of a curse. Whereas if we were looking at her, why did Cassie live? Why didn't she die when she wanted to die? Here she is to bring some drops of water and a friendly touch to Uncle Tom. There she is. And Tom says to her, he drank the water, and he looked earnestly and pitifully into her face. Oh, Mrs., I wished you'd go to him that can give you living waters. Here is Tom. He's been whipped, and Lucy's in there, snuck in there to give him some water and some kind words if she can. And he's witnessing to her. And that's the end of chapter 34. So was that mercy killing when she killed her child? What do you think? Mercy killing and their victims usually fall into one of two categories. One of these categories: killing terminally, chronically ill, disabled, or elderly spouse. So occasionally, even this year, there's been a case where an elderly woman or a man, I can't remember which, went into a hospital with a gun with one bullet and killed their spouse in the hospital bed. They had already made this agreement. The person was dying and really suffering. They killed them and then just sat there and waited for the police to come. So a chronically ill, disabled, or elderly spouse, parents killing a disabled child, killing children, elderly, sick, or a disabled parent, or children killing elderly, sick, or disabled parents. So parents just begging, kill me, kill me, kill me, and the kids can't take it, and they finally do. Or a nurse killing a patient, thinking they're taking up too much money. It'll be nicer for the family if they die. I'll just overdose them. Horrific nurses, there are a few of those caught here and there. Doctors killing the elderly, sick, or disabled patient for the same thing. Mercy killing, while regarded by some as an act of compassion, is seen by others as an act of despair or desperation and an inability to ask for help. Because what's our reality in 2023? Now, I don't know about long ago, excuse me, but in 2023, we have morphine. And as a person who's had, I've had at least 13 major surgeries, as a person who has experienced morphine over and over again, if you have morphine, you can cut somebody's leg off and they're not even going to care. I'm serious. We have the ability to stop pain, and a desperation and an inability to ask for help. I do think this is true. Do I think it's bad, somebody that's in pain, to give them so much morphine that they're kind of out of their head? Well, it depends on how much they care about pain. And if they would rather be out of their head and no pain, then I do think a person probably ask your mom, your dad, your pastor, ask them. Media coverage is usually more sympathetic to the perp than the victim. If you have a man in a hospital bed who begs his wife to kill her and says, remember, we made a pact, whoever got desperately sick and ill and had no prospect for recovery. Now we have things like a DNR, do not resuscitate. You can write that order so that if you're in the hospital and your heart stops, they won't all come running in to wake you up again. They hang that over your bed so that if God tries to take you with a heart attack or a stroke or something, they will not do that. And you can leave your, what do they call that? They want you to have it at the hospital so that if something happens to you, you have already described what level of care you want and what level of care you do not want. And but people are usually feel more sorry, like for the lady that killed her husband, than they do for the husband that was killed, because he wanted to be killed and the lady was trying to do something her husband wanted her to do. Murder and suicide among the elderly are usually without the wife's knowledge or consent. It's usually a man who kills his wife and then kills himself. Sometimes his whole family. About once a year, you'll see something like that, where the guy kills his wife and his whole family. Either he's lost all his money, lose his job, and he doesn't want them to be on welfare or anything. It's better if we all die. Disabled children's rights get eroded when a parent killer is treated leniently. If you have a parent who kills a child that's disabled, that makes disabled children's rights worse, because you're basically telling people that these disabled children are better off dead. When adult children kill a parent, it's often because they're the ones who can't bear to deal with it anymore, not because the parent's crying to be killed, because the person taking care of them just can't take it anymore. Caregivers might be in danger of killing a loved one because they have a problem coping or relinquishing control. Now, what was it that Cassie did? What do you think? Was that mercy killing? What was Cassie's situation? And I would like to present with you an alternative idea for Cassie. I would like to say that Cassie certainly has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that she was probably legally insane when she killed her baby. She was so upset at the idea of that little boy that looked like Henry growing up and becoming a slave, and all the things that could happen to him, and all the things that could happen to her children, and being separated. It was so much, and she had the wave of the memories of all of these things coming over her that she could not handle that idea, and she killed her child. I think today in a court in 2023, she'd go scot-free and be assigned counseling, that she would basically be forgiven. People would say she obviously has post-traumatic stress disorder. She was reliving other incidents, and she really she was not in her right mind, and she didn't know what she was doing. But talk about that to your mom and dad, not Lucy's situation, Cassie's situation, and see what you think. Okay, comparisons about the US Constitution. The theist, of course, knows it's a covenant. Those theists, those early Puritans, they were all about covenants. And of course, marriage is a covenant. Justice Antonin Scalia, I'm so sorry that he died from the US Supreme Court. He's deceased, but he's worth reading about. He was Catholic, but he definitely was a Christian, and he's still being quoted all the time. Make yourself familiar with him. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, I don't know if he's really a Christian. I know he's Catholic. Clarence Thomas, here in blue, he's the bright light on the US Supreme Court. He's been there for a long time. Eventually, he's going to get old and retire or die or something. But Clarence Thomas, he really is the smartest person on that bench of 9 people now. Clarence Thomas is a smart one. And he's Black. If you didn't know he's Black, he's Black. But he's the smartest one on the US Supreme Court. He is amazing. His dissents are absolutely amazing. The abortion ruling, Roe versus Wade, in reversing that, Clarence Thomas, I think it's about 96 pages long, but you can look up Clarence Thomas, Roe versus Wade, and read everything that he said. It's amazing what logical reasons he walks through of why they rescinded Roe versus Wade, how unconstitutional Roe versus Wade was. Really makes an amazing argument. It's worth reading. Even though it's 96 pages, they're really, they're scanned in, they're short pages. You can read it in a couple of hours. The deists, what do they think about the Constitution? They wrote it. It's a social contract. They knew that the 3-part government, they put all these things in order. And what do the romantics think? Think of 2023. What do they think about the Constitution? Oh my goodness, it's old. It's got to change. It needs to be a living document that changes to serve the people historically. We got to get rid of all the old stuff. What about law? The theist knows moral law does not change, that there are things that are morally true. There is true truth that is true now, that will always be true, that always was true for all people in all places. What does the deist think about law? Law is based on what's good for the people, and that still was based on the Bible. What do the romantics think about law? It's not universal. The law also has to be living, and it's got to change as the people change. You don't want weird things illegal anymore, and that's true in a small part. The romantic always has a little bit of a good idea, but a big part of their idea is not a good idea because they're following their heart. What about human nature? Oh, the theist knows. Man is depraved, right? You got to be born again. We are born depraved. You got to be born again. That's why our Constitution has all of those checks and balances set in, because we know people are bad. People are going to always try to get away with whatever they can get away with. Your mom knows that. Why do you think you have to be born as a kid and raised up in a family? Your mom and dad are the allegorical equivalent of God to you. They're not always right, but they are the ones there to rub off your rough edges. God has chosen them to be your parents so that by the time you are an adult, you will be able to obey God. If you're able to obey your parents, you'll be able to obey God. You'll be able to follow his direction and do what is right, even when it's a hard thing to do. The theist just assumes a corrupt nature. The deist really, especially the old-time deists, they want to study man, find ways to become more perfect. The modern deist is an atheist deist. And of course, he presumes that we have a moral nature. We're born good, and then society is what ruins us. Freud has an essay called Civilization and Its Discontents. I think it's plenty clean enough to read. It's only a few pages long. Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud, that says basically we're born good and then society ruins us. Remember the little hand-drawn diagram we looked at? Okay, the romantic man is unique and an individual. Each must find their own truth. What's true for you is not true for me. And what did Ralph Waldo Emerson said? Remember, imitation is suicide. What about marriage? The theist says it's a covenant. Are you kidding? It's from God, it's sacred. So there's this covenant accountability. It's lifelong, one man, one woman. It's a commitment before God. There are only a couple of exceptions, for getting divorced. The deist, it's a social contract, and that's what we do, and we stand by those. The romantic, you got to follow your heart. We're not married for as long as we both shall live. It's now as long as we both shall love. You try it out, you see how it works. And if we didn't have the complication of children and families and the tearing apart and what that does to society, maybe you could live that way, but we're not that way. We're humans. Okay. We're going to shift gears here, and we're going to start looking at some literary heroes. And of course, Uncle Tom's going to be way up on the list because we're reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. The traditional literary hero, a theistic hero, is worthy of imitation. You want to be like him or her. They're Christ types. They're self-sacrificing. They're strong. They're brave. They're humble. They're loyal. If you're writing a paper about Uncle Tom, these are all your adjectives. Humble, loyal, wise, honest, religious, works hard to benefit others, self-sacrificing, puts the well-being of others before themselves. Think of Joseph in Egypt. Good allegory there. The romantic anti-hero, we don't even call them heroes. We don't even call them romantic heroes. We call them an anti-hero because they're not worthy of imitation. They're selfish. They might be brave, especially in movies and things, be brave, but they might just be a coward, or run away. They're arrogant, they're egocentric, they're usually a loner, they're certainly not religious. In fact, usually there's a theological void in the book or movie, and they don't fit into civilization, right? They just don't fit in. Well, think of Tarzan. He was brought up by animals, so he is more morally good than the other people who come in to hunt who are morally bad because they've been in civilization forever. Huckleberry Finn, we're almost to Huck Finn next week. Do bring your book. Huckleberry Finn, he's basically been brought up alone. And so he is also morally better because society believes slavery is right. He just feels like it's wrong and he helps Jim escape. He is more morally fit because he's not grown up in civilization and gone to regular school. What about Mowgli? If you've read the Jungle Book, Mowgli brought up by the jungle, so he is more morally good. All the people are morally bad who are in civilization. Indiana Jones, I know it's not a book, it's a movie. Jack Sparrow, the pirate, who is a horrible person. He's a pirate, good grief, besides the fact that he's really a ghost, but he's a pirate, which means he goes around pillaging, raping, stealing, doing horrible things, and yet he's the main character. That's called an anti-hero. And we laugh because he's really funny, but that's definitely adult style humor, funny for adults to watch, and those who are too young. You certainly don't want your little brother thinking, I want to be a pirate, I want to be a pirate. That's a more immoral person. Indiana Jones is the same way. He's a loner. They don't play well with others, that kind of person. Jack Bauer, you may not, if you're a homeschooler, Christian homeschooler, may not have heard of him. He had a show for a while back called 24. I watched an episode of that. Oh my goodness, every episode, the world's going to end unless he makes some kind of moral compromise. For example, the bad guys are going to destroy the world unless Jack Bauer goes and kills this good person, but who is an enemy to these bad people who are going to destroy the world. You got to go kill this good person, put their head in the sack, deliver their head to these people, and then they won't blow up the bomb that'll kill 3 million people. And so every episode is a moral challenge where they challenge, is it good to kill one good person to save 3 million people in general? That type thing. Situations that really would never arise, but it's challenging. The Lone Ranger. Okay, he's a traditional hero. The Lone Ranger, Uncle Tom, Thor. I saw one Thor movie, and at that time he was unwilling to sleep with a girl and he was willing to die for his people, so I put him on this list. Lassie, I know she's a dog, but Lassie would die for people. Sam Gamgee, George MacDonald's knights in his fairy tales. If you like C.S. Lewis, you'll like George MacDonald. He wrote fairy tales. He was prior to C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis says he never wrote a book that he was not using George MacDonald's ideas. Amazing, really. Captain America, the first one anyway, he was a moral person willing to die for his people. So possibly that Thor and Captain America no longer apply to that since they've made additional movies. I don't know if they sleep with their heroines or not now. Okay, going to our structured notes. We're shifting gear again here. The Transcendentalists, we're going to remember this, Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott. These are our primary Transcendentalists. Emerson, we call him the sage of Concord, the prophet of the wise man of Concord, a determined self-reliance. He's cultural icons of the American spirit. In his journal, he made this entry, and I think we read part of it, in self-reliance. Yes, I dreamed that I floated at will in the great ether, and I saw this world floating also not so far off, but diminished to the size of an apple. Then an angel took it in his hand and brought it to me and said, "This thou must eat." Oh, even King James style English. "This thou must eat." And I ate the world. Okay, we read nature. which is all about nature. The currents of that should say what Ralph Waldo Emerson, the currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God, it should say Ralph Waldo Emerson there. The American scholar Oliver Wendell Holmes called this essay The Intellectual Independence of America. And the Divinity School address, that true religion is in you, it was an address to a seminary, to a divinity school. And after that, he wasn't allowed back on campus for, I think it was more than 30 years. It's really kind of funny because it was not a proper theological address. And the hymn sung at the completion of the Concord Monument in our Dover edition, remember the Battle of Concord? That was a great poem. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Hence once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps. And remember, this was before, the poem is a little late here, 1836, but this was the shot fired, the shot heard round the world is the shot that started our war for independence. And fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, because he's standing there at the site, and that's why it's called the Concord Hymn, and it was a long time ago. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps at the graveyard. And time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone. They put up a memorial. That memory may their deed redeem when, like our sires, our sons are gone. Spirit, who made those freemen dare to die or leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. Isn't that an amazing poem? And Henry David Thoreau's a bit of a review here. Philosopher, also a mystic, a transcendentalist, believing you could transcend civil disobedience. You wrote it, the refusal. He wrote this after the refusal to pay the poll tax toward the Mexican War because that benefited the Southern slave owners. Walden, cool to read, kind of boring most parts, but you read part of Walden, and really the idea to live deliberately and not find that when you die that you hadn't lived at all. Some really cool quotes, and these get put on graduation cards. They're cool, especially if you look at it with a Christian viewpoint, living deliberately. Unitarianism, kind of a funny, they're not a Baptist, they were Unitarians. These people deny the doctrine of the Trinity. They deny original sin. They deny vicarious atonement, that Christ died for us. They deny the deity of Christ. They deny everlasting damnation. Basically, all that's left in the church of the Unitarians was communion and baptism. And Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister. You can kind of tell this is why they're not really very religious. There's a direct connection, the transcendentalist thought, between the universe and the individual soul. That's why Emerson said, I'm part and parcel of God. Nature basically is the gospel. You follow your own intuition. Remember, Emerson said imitation is suicide. You follow your own intuition, your feelings, your beliefs, no matter how different they are from the social norm. You rely on yourself to know what's right. It's self-reliance. That's why we read the essay. So the authors, the transcendental authors you need to know are Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott. You got to know these names. These are the transcendentalists. And this unknown quote, it's a great homeschool lady writer, and I don't have her name, so I just say author unknown. The Bible, I used to have the book. The Bible is like a vine with branches spreading across time and continents. The scriptures have provided inspiration for the greatest musicians, poets, artists, and scientists. All moral progress of our race is directly from the Bible. That is just the coolest quote, coolest quote. I used to print that up on bookmarks. Try to imagine removing the influence of the Bible from all our art, architecture, law books, scientific laws and theories, poetry, music. What would you have left? The Bible is the dividing line between chaos and civilization. Isn't that the truth? All right, our structured notes introducing these beyond the pale of belief flavors of romanticism, realism, naturalism, and determinism. The rise of realism is basically from the Civil War to World War I, lots of overlap. So you do have naturalistic writers in the time of realism and even during the Civil War before. You do have lots of crossover, but these are the general categories. The American Renaissance, which means not the American Reformation, not the rebirth of Christian ideals, the American Renaissance, where you revive all of these classical ideals, which would be pagan ideals. The United States made a giant shift toward humanism after the Civil War, which was 1861 to 1865. You have to have those dates memorized. The optimism of our young nation gave way after the war to a period of reconstruction and rethinking. You kind of rethink everything. A civil war is about the worst thing that can happen to a country besides just total annihilation. That brother against brother. I told you the story of my grandma and her, in the past, kin who lived during the time of the Civil War. Family split. Some fought for the North, some fought for the South, and never spoke to each other again. No forgiving that, really. So the optimism gives way. And then you have Reconstruction, which means the reconstruction of the South, because the South was ruined during the Civil War. And then rethinking, what really are we all about? American idealism remained, but changed toward a more human focus and away from the theistic remnants of Puritan thinking. The Puritans were thought about less and less and less. After the Civil War, it kind of, imagine what the Puritans would have said about human slavery. Yeah, they would have marched right in there and said, this is wrong and you cannot do this. Tom, come with me. And they would have, hauled him out of there. That's what the Puritans would have done. So we have very few remnants of the Puritan thinkers now. Sometimes we refer to this slow evolution of thought as the American Renaissance, but it's really a giant shift toward humanism, which would be very negative. So this American Renaissance, the deism of our forefathers just gives way to the rise of realism. And they really believe this is the way life is. It's kind of harsh, and that's just the way it is. You really don't make up, and then you're all okay after this. So it's kind of wiping out the optimism of romanticism in the face of stark reality of a post-war country. Some were losers. A bunch of them lost. And a bunch of people were drug away from their own country. And some people, even Christians, thought, well, the best thing to do with the African Americans who had been slaves then, who were freed, was to ship them back to Africa, thinking, oh, well, they want to go back to Africa. But the thing is once you're in America, nobody wants to go back. Nobody wants to leave. I mean, you and me, we all have forefathers who came from all other places over the last few centuries, because everybody wants to live in America. If you work really hard, you can do really well. Nobody cares. You work really hard and speak perfect English and write well, read well, speak well, you can do pretty much anything you want here, right? So nobody wanted to go back to Africa. Nobody wanted to go back to Africa. So that's the stark reality of our post-Civil War country. Before the Civil War, idealists were championing human rights, especially the abolition of slavery. After the Civil War, Americans increasingly idealized progress and the self-made man. Let's concentrate more on men. They didn't want to all go to church, and like all the Southern churches were not repenting. They weren't in church repenting. Oh Lord, we're so sorry. How did we ever think slavery was a thing? We're so sorry. And then they didn't go out and serve the slaves and say, we're so sorry, we'll help you find your families. We repent from all this. No, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. This was an era of the millionaire. When you get into those early 1800s, this is when people made their fortunes. And if you are a social Darwinist and you believe that the survival of the fittest is those who claw their ways to the top, the survivors, just like if you're animals, this social Darwinism and survival of the fittest, that kind of approved these very unethical methods that these people used to claw their ways to the top, paying people next to nothing, but they became millionaires. It would be the equivalent today of billionaires. That's the world of Melville's Bartleby. I always apologize to American Lit kids that you got to read it, but you get to read it. This reflects this time period when people went and worked in factories. They left the farms, they went and worked in factories. It used to be that if you had somebody that was less than normal in your family, if you all lived on a farm, that was okay. They could stay on the farm, they could work on the farm, and they could still have a happy life. If you all live in the city, especially if you're in a high-rise apartment, crowded in and hardly anybody makes any money, and you have somebody who's not quite normal, they're going to go out and offend people, even accidentally committing crimes. and getting in trouble all the time, and they're not going to have a very nice life. That's the reality of everybody moving from farms to the city. And that's what we see in Bartleby. Poor Bartleby is kind of a product of his environment. He's just not ready. He can't live forever being a human copy machine. That's what Bartleby is. And so he's a good reflection of this time period. And so we read Bartleby. Business boomed after the Civil War. War production had boosted industry in the North because the North won. Factory leaders, former farmers learned valuable experience in the management of men and machines. America's wealth of natural resources, iron, coal, oil, gold, silver, benefited businesses. The new intercontinental rail system, woo! That's like going to space now. Inaugurated in 1869, that's right after the Civil War. And the transcontinental telegraph, laying down that line across the ocean. Wow. So that you could talk with people overseas instantly instead of waiting for boats to go across with letters. It began operating in 1861. During the Civil War, opened up a new world for industry to access materials, large markets, communications, you could buy and sell and all that. The constant arrival of immigrants provided seemingly endless supply of inexpensive labor as well, which fueled rapid construction. So you have all these people, they're coming over, they're willing to do anything. When I was your age in the 70s, in our high schools, we were being inundated with Vietnamese. And you had to be pretty smart to do better than a Vietnamese kid, because it's kind of like what the Koreans do today in American high schools. Wow, do they score? And Chinese, wow, do they score? Their entire life is all about school and getting to the top and being the best. And it was, we were lazy and we were spoiled kids in the 70s. And these kids have come over and their parents brought them over, and then they're born here and they want to work. They want a job. A lot of my family is Filipino. And then they brought more of their relatives over here, legal immigration, which took 23 years legally to immigrate from the Philippines here. They had to work really hard, and my relative had to have a lot of money to show that he could support them while he found jobs. And every one of them came over here and worked them their fingers to the bones, long hours, and are all successful now. Immigrants come over and they're not coming over to be lazy and live off the system. Legal immigrants, they're coming to work really hard and make the world a better place for their kids and their grandkids. Over 23 million immigrants, German, Scandinavian, Irish in the early years, Southern Europeans, all people from all over the world flowed into the United States between 1860 and 1910. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino contract laborers were imported by railroad countries and other American business interests on the West Coast. And this was kind of sad because these Japanese and Filipino and Chinese people basically were slaves. Many unethical work bosses or work leads would give them just enough wages, and then they would provide a place for them to live in a company store and charge them everything that they made to pay for their living space in the company store, so that they could never save any money and never get ahead. And they were basically treated like slaves. Horrible things happened to some of these Asian people during after the Civil War. In 1860, most Americans lived on farm before the Civil War. This is my grandpa. He sold, he was born in 1904, I think. And most Americans lived on small farms or small villages. By 1919, 59 years later, half the population was concentrated in about 12 cities. This is my grandpa who grew up picking watermelons. So he's sitting there with a watermelon. That's what he did. The problems of city living appeared soon after. We kind of know that even in the homeschool community, that homeschoolers tend to try to be rural. If they can afford to go live on a little farm, they will. If they have to live in the city because they can't afford land, then they will. But homeschoolers really prefer living on farms with big families, because city living does bring all types of problems. Poor, overcrowded housing, unsanitary, unsafe conditions is what we saw in these early days. Difficult working conditions, even children working, and not enough restraints on business. Business could get away with whatever they wanted with, and then every time some horrible thing happened, they'd make a new law. And then the next horrible thing would happen and you make a new law. And it takes a long time. Labor unions grew, strikes brought the plight of working people to national awareness. Farmers too saw themselves struggling against the money interest of the American East, those robber barons. They're actually called robber barons. People like J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller, the Hunt families, the Kellogg families. That's how they made their fortunes, on the backs of other people. The farmer gradually changed from a cultural icon of integrity to an object of ridicule, lampooned as hicks or rubes. My grandma, my name is Thelma, and my grandma Thelma is the young girl in the middle. She's a teenager here. This was early 1920s. She's a teenager, and everybody bobbed their hair. Later on this year, we'll read Bernice Bobs Her Hair. You can tell how the two oldest girls here have bobbed their hair. Not the best look, but everybody was doing it. You know, the grandmas had long hair and all that. These girls are even wearing pants. They're funny looking pants, but they're wearing pants. That's a big deal, but they definitely have that hick look. So city dwellers would definitely be calling these farmers hicks, even though they're really hard workers and they're good people. My grandma was an amazing woman. I knew all these people when I was real little. Millionaires, the idyllic American of the post-Civil War period became a millionaire, the equivalent today of a billionaire. In 1860, there were fewer than 100 millionaires. By 1875, 15 years later, there were more than 1,000 millionaires. People made money. From 1860 to 1914, this is just before World War I. World War I starts in 1914. The United States was transformed from a small, young agricultural ex-colony, remember, a colony, barely, to a huge, modern industrial nation. And of course, cars are a huge part of that. A debtor nation in 1860. By 1914, 54 years later, we'd become the world's wealthiest nation, with a population that had more than doubled, rising from 31 million in 1860 to 76 million in 1900. By World War I, 1914 and 1918, the United States had become a major world power. The small town comfort and security, the rural life on a family farm, gave way to an empty city life, reflected in the literature of the time. And that's why we read short stories like Bartleby. We don't have time to read entire novels by each of these people, so we read short stories. But Bartleby reflects that. The person who just really doesn't fit in the city life, he just doesn't fit there. Most of you probably know somebody who just doesn't fit, and they probably live in the city. If they live in the country, you don't have to fit. You can just take care of the horses, or take care of the cows, or take care of the dogs and milk the cows. And you can be your own unique, unusual, not normal person with a lesser mentality, something like that, but not in the city. In the city, that person is going to loiter places, get in trouble, even go to jail for loitering, and get in all types of trouble. And the farm life would have been the answer for that. But you can't do that in modernity. Stephen Crane, we're going to start meeting these authors. Stephen Crane, he did not fight in the Civil War, but he writes like he did. And that makes Civil War generals mad. He wrote The Red Badge of Courage, is a short novel. If you want to CLEP American Lit, take the CLEP test and get a college credit for this, you will have to read The Red Badge of Courage. You'll have to read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and you'll have to read a little more poetry than what I offer in this class. But you can take a sample CLEP test online, see how well you do, study up for that, and get a college credit for this class. I've had numerous students do that. He did write good short stories, The Open Boat and The Men in the Storm, great short stories. And that's why we read short stories. Crane highlights the damage of economic forces and alienation on the weak or vulnerable individual, the people I just talked about. We're going to see man fighting heroically against the faceless, unfeeling elements of nature in his short story, The Open Boat. If you don't believe in God, if you live in a theological void, if you're an atheist, basically, you didn't really talk about it in the early 1900s because nobody would listen to you or read your stuff. They knew, they could tell you were atheist. And nature is kind of against you, and you're just tiny, tiny, tiny. You're nothing, and nature's against you. And that was what The Open Boat was all about. We see men behaving like animals because they've read Darwin, right? They think men do behave like animals. You're going to see this social Darwinism in Crane's Red Badge of Courage. We're going to read a short overview of the Red Badge of Courage, and then we'll also read in your syllabus reading what a Civil War general has to say about that book. Does it follow what the Civil War was really like? No. And in his short story, The Men in the Storm. The novel Red Badge of Courage was written in 3 days, and it was written on a drunken dare. And then Stephen Crane died really young. Jack London, we're going to read about Jack London, Call of the Wild, To Build a Fire. Call of the Wild is the novel, and where, you know, the nice guy fails. You got to be really strong and harsh and willing to step on everybody else to survive. It's survival of the fittest. And To Build a Fire, we'll read the short story, which you kind of learn the same thing, survival of the fittest. Jack London said, the proper function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time. Yeah, how atheist can you get? Jack London, born 1876, credited his literary success to hard work. He fought his way up to become the highest paid novelist of his day. Along with writing, London oversaw the building of a custom-made ship, the Snark, and supervised the operation of his beauty ranch. That's what he called his ranch. London also spoke on socialism and other economic and political topics. He was really out there pushing his beliefs. Jack London divorced his first wife and the mother of his 2 daughters and remarried. He was known to beat his wives, right? If they didn't, you know, he was an animal. He lived an active life until he was 40. And it's not politically correct to even publish this anymore. But when he just couldn't do it anymore, when he felt himself weakening, he committed suicide. Important themes in London's work include the struggle to survive. Man is an animal. Survive with dignity becomes the purpose. If you're going to die, die with dignity. Survive with dignity if you can. And the questions of life and death. And he wove these ideas into stories of high adventure based mostly on firsthand experience, which is pretty amazing. Realism, the more severe part of realism, or even naturalism, life is short and then you die, right? Life is short and then you die. And it's all about survivors. In realistic fiction, short stories and novels, you're going to see survivors. And often the problem is, however, how they survive. How well do they survive, and how well do they die? Do they die with their integrity intact? So realism, naturalism, it always ends poorly because usually they die. You don't have to read the end of the story to guess what's going to happen. It's going to be a sad ending. A modern day example would be the film The Perfect Storm. This is from about 10 or 15 years ago, and my husband took me to see this. The characters are all losers. It's these guys up in Alaska, and they're going to go. Don't go watch it. It's absolutely ridiculous. It was a waste. I wanted my 2 hours back. But the characters are all losers. It's all these Alaskan fishermen, and it's really too stormy to go out anymore, but they all really need the money. They've all messed up their lives. They smoke and drink, and they're alcoholics and all that. And they just decide they're going to go out one more time and make one more fish catch and get more money, and they'll be okay. And one leaves, you know, his wife. He's kind of got a wrecked marriage. One is a horrible father to his teenage son. They show little aspects of that, and then they all get on this boat and they go out, and then they get in this storm, which happens to be like a perfect storm, like no survivors, that type thing. There's no mention of God. It's a theological void, and they all die in the end. And I was so upset because I thought this movie, at first as they started dying off, I thought, oh no, look at all these people. Oh, I know what this is. This is one of those movies where one guy's going to survive. I bet the guy that survives is going to go back and apologize to his son for being a bad father. He's going to quit drinking. He's going to save his family. That's what's going to happen. We're going to have this happiness at the end, some resolution. And then when the last guy died, I felt like, I want my 2 hours back. So the whole idea is life is short and then you die anyway. So we're sliding from theism to deism right into romanticism. And one of the worst flavors of romanticism, of course, is realism. And then as it gets worse, it's naturalism. And as it gets even worse, it's determinism. Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, Stephen Crane, John Steinbeck all reflect this growing pessimism with life in a theological void. Man is written as a purposeless animal who struggles heroically against nature to find meaning in a harsh, senseless world. Nothing makes sense. You just do the best you can. The only survivor is the guy who learns survival of the fittest. and has instincts like an animal. He trains his instincts. Some survivors, like Twain's Huck Finn, endure through inner strength involving kindness, flexibility, and above all, individuality. Although he was an atheist, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, believed good people like Huck could change their world. And Mark Twain, going back here to Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, he didn't do it like Harriet Beecher Stowe did. He didn't write a novel that was going to make you cry and wish you had Puritans to go in there and whoop them all on the behind and tell them they couldn't have slaves anymore and take the slaves and start a school and teach them and help them and all that. He didn't do that kind of book. He wrote a book where it is so ridiculous that Jim is a slave. Jim basically is he's shown here on the raft with Huck Finn. Jim is the best father figure in the book, and he's a slave. And he's uneducated, he's ignorant, but he's the best father figure. And so, which is absolutely ridiculous that he's this poor slave, and he's the best father figure that Huck Finn has. And he kind of rescues Huck Finn. He really is a good character. He's not quite as Christ-like as Uncle Tom, but he's just as good. But it shows the ridiculousness of slavery. And there's quite a bit of humor in this book. People think it's a boys' book. No, it's really an adult book. Mark Twain just decided to make you laugh about the stupidity of slavery instead of making you cry. Other survivors make it in these stories by cheating, lying, conniving, right? Remember, these anti-heroes, they cheat, they lie, they sneak, they steal to give them the upper hand. Red Badge of Courage, Call of the Wild, all are Darwin's survival of the fittest in action. It's all Darwin. Stephen Crane, Ernest Hemingway, Jack London were all skeptics of goodness and the idea that you could be reborn, and had all turned away from any kind of theistic concept to naturalism, which really is romanticism turned very, very ugly into survival of the fittest. The slide from theism to deism was really subtle. The slide from deism to naturalism, those darker varieties of romanticism and art, literature, and music, really was a natural next step, one step further away from God, but had more implications. It was worse. To kind of make man into an animal is really the worst you can get, because then it comes down to survival of the fittest, and you crawl and sneak and connive your way to the top. Our country had moved from providence to self-reliance in 300 years. There are no grandchildren in the kingdom of God. Those Puritans, they're kids. If somebody doesn't teach you about Jesus, you're going to go the way of the world. Personal religious experience has to be experienced personally. It can't be passed down. We see the American understanding of God move from a personal experience to that of an impersonal force, the force of nature, to that of just the denial of the existence of God, where we get to Dawkins. Frontier, humor, and regionalism. This is a fun period. We're going to have a little bit of fun with this. In ragged frontier villages on riverboats, so out west here, in mining camps and around cowboy campfires, far from city amusements, they tell stories, big ones. For example, Casey Jones, the railway engineer, and Paul Bunyan, the giant logger, and his big blue ox named. Do you remember what his big blue ox was named? His legend arose about 1906 and was retold over and over with little changes and stuff like that. Babe, remember his blue ox named Babe? Kit Carson, the story of the fearless Indian fighter. Of course, now we call him an Indian killer by most politically correct historians. Davy Crockett, the Tennessee scout who became an American folk hero, soldier, and then a politician. And of course, we're going to read a story, Frontier Regionalism. We'll read a story called A Bride Comes to Yellow Sky. And it's hilarious. It's this town where the drunk gets locked up every weekend for drinking, and the sheriff is single, and the sheriff kind of gets a mail order wife, and he goes to get her and he brings her back. And when a nice lady comes to this town, the drunks, the bad people, they're all shook up because the sheriff's got a wife. They all have to behave. It's actually hilarious. So we'll read some of those funny stories, frontier humor and regionalism. Local colorists like Mark Twain, who add, it's not people of color, but color to writing. Samuel Clemens, What an amazing life. Through the character of Huck, Twain allowed the world to experience life on a raft in the Mississippi River. Twain wrote in a style that reflected both romanticism and realism. So it's kind of really the best of both worlds, with a decided favor towards realism. It was common for writers to take a pen name, and Samuel Clemens just chose Mark Twain. Bret Hart wrote about the vanishing West, right? The cowboys are disappearing. It's becoming like a city. That era is called the vanishing West. He was born in New York. His father was a Greek professor who died young. Bret left school and went to California at age 17. He was a teacher, miner, a printer, express messenger, secretary to the U.S. Mint in San Francisco, and an editor, dying in London in 1902. So he really saw and experienced life. He wrote all his life, but never surpassed his earliest short stories. We'll read his story, The Luck of Roaring Camp. Absolutely hilarious about this mining camp where the only woman in town is the town prostitute, and what happens when a baby's born in a town like that. And it's all humor, it's all funny. One of the Vanishing West stories, we're going to be reading that session 26. Hart was 10 when the California gold rush began in 1849, and that served as the inspiration for a lot of his stories. What is naturalism, realism, determinism? What kind of themes are we going to see in these plots coming up in future sessions? The universe. It's unpredictable, it's spontaneous, it's discontinuous. Remember, this is a theological void. Our fate is determined by our environment, by hereditary, what we're born with. Remember, they believed you were born with these traits, and by chance. Free will, that's all fake and an illusion. You don't have free will. Nature kind of determines what's going to happen with you. And basically, instead of life is short and then you die, life is a cruel joke. Very sad worldview. Stephen Crane, Jack London, Henry James, all naturalists who use literary realism to relate the individual to society. Often they expose social problems and were very much influenced by Darwinian thought and the related philosophy, which is naturalism, which considers men to be animals in a world that is beyond their control. They're not in control of themselves. Naturalism is essentially a literary expression of determinism. Naturalism is also called determinism because of its belief in the effects of the environment, hereditary. Remember, you inherit what you're going to be, and chance on human life. The survivor makes it to the end of the novel or the short story by his determined steadfastness and will to live against incredible odds, and then usually just dies really well. Or by their own choice or how they want to die. If the anti-hero dies, he dies proudly in the way he picks. The story might feature dreary, realistic depictions, nose picking, things like that. Lower class life with really grim details, because these people born into, for example, poverty, stuck in poverty forever, but die really bravely, and so they're the hero or anti-hero. Naturalism, it just denies God as our religion, as a motivating force in the world. It operates in a theological world. They don't even talk about there is no God. They just operate as if there is no God. The universe is a mindless machine. 18th century Enlightenment thinkers had also imagined the world as a machine, but they thought the world was this perfect one, invented by God and kind of tending toward progress and human betterment. Naturalists imagine the world instead a blind machine, godless, and just out of control. The journey from theism to deism and from deism to naturalism was a short one in our country's history. From 1620 to 1865, all of that happened. Stephen Crane, Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, writing about a prostitute. We're not reading that one, but it was a literary milestone in 1893. He's the one who wrote The Men in a Boat and the stories I mentioned earlier. Okay, these are the sources that I utilized this week. You have a good week, and I will see you next week. Bring Huckleberry Finn to class and enjoy finishing up Uncle Tom's Cabin. More tears in store. That's just the way that this goes this time of the year. And may the Lord bless you. Bye.